Okay, one dimension around which social stratification operates is social class. This is a tricky term, and it's the kind of concept that sociologists debate a lot. What exactly is social class and what exactly are the right social class categories? How should we think about and measure social class? So it's really tricky for even sociologists to get a handle on, and we have different ways of thinking about that sociologically. And it's also tricky for us because here in the U.S., quite frankly, we don't talk about social class. We don't have the same kind of language around social class that even some other countries have. But nevertheless, social class is super important, and it permeates so much of what we do, how we live our lives, so much of the opportunities that we have and life chances that we have, and it permeates our social relationships, especially inside of workplaces. So we need to get a handle on what exactly we mean by social class. So one way is to just think about, okay, what do you think about when you think about social class? What are the ways that you think about social class? And when I normally ask this question, when you ask someone this question, typically you end up with some kind of a gradational scale from upper class, upper middle class, lower class, some version of that. And there's different ways of then slicing in different parts or pieces of the upper middle class, lower upper middle class, things like this. But really, this doesn't help us to actually think about what social class is. It's a kind of gradational scale. But what we really need, and what a good definition, I'm going to argue, for social class, a good sociological definition, has to really capture the social relationships that exist around class categories. That is, it has to express the way that some people in some social classes can dominate other people in other social classes and can use their class position to extract and control economic resources. So we're going to try then to build up a definition of social class that really captures that while capturing the salient dimensions that sociologists use to talk about social class. At the broadest level, when we're talking about social class, what we're talking about is positions within an economic structure. So we're thinking about social positions, right? It's not about people or individuals. We're thinking about social positions and how they exist or how they're related to each other within some broader economic structure. So we can think in that way about how it is that people in different social classes kind of do different things and exist in different ways in an economy, and how they have different social relationships in an economy. So you think about something like a hospital, right? This has a sets of social classes positioned within it. So there's a CEO of that hospital, there are doctors, there are nurses, there are nurse managers, there are technicians, and there are janitors. All of them are doing different things in a division of labor, but what's important for social class is that they have different social relationships to each other. CEOs are in control of the organization. They direct the organization. Doctors have specific skills that enable them to be in control of their own work and oftentimes to control other people's work. There are nurse managers who are directing and organizing the activities of the nurses. And there are technicians who are tasked with bringing people from one place to another in the hospital, janitors who are tasked with cleaning up the hospital. All of them have then different positions within that hospital. So let's really think about, though, what makes those positions distinctive. How are we to think about the distinctiveness of those positions? So there's really three dimensions here that I want to articulate around class structure. These are pretty common ways, and I would actually think across different versions of social class as a concept within sociology, these really thread across most ways of thinking about social class. One of them comes from this guy, Karl Marx, who you may actually be familiar with. And he has a particularly important way of thinking about social class that's related to what he calls property relationships. So this is linking back to the way in which the way that we produce particular objects for sale in an economy, and who has control over their work within that, and who has control over what it is that they produce. And specifically for Marx, this is about who controls what he calls the means of production. And that's really just a way of thinking about, talking about who controls the productive resources within a society. And so he divides the world up into the propertied and the propertyless. He divides the world up into what he calls capitalists and workers. And capitalists are the people who own the means of production. They own and control the property, the resources, the properties that we use to make things in our society, the productive resources of a society. They own the means of production. And everyone else, those who don't own the means of production, he calls workers, and they are excluded from access to the means of production, to producing things, unless they sell themselves as laborers. They sell their labor power, their ability to work. So imagine a factory. There are lots of tools and machines inside of that factory. There's the factory itself. The owners, the capitalists own those machines and those properties, right? And workers can't do anything with them unless they sell their ability to work on those machines to the capitalist in exchange for a wage. That's at the core of what social class is for Marx, and that for us represents a key starting dimension for thinking about class structure. Who owns the property? Who owns what in the economy? Do you own those means of production? Do you own those productive resources, or do you only own your labor power? Right, so that gives us that kind of two-class structure. And then this guy, Max Weber, another sociologist, writing shortly after Marx's time, in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, says, okay, yes, that makes some sense, but not everyone's labor power is the same, right? And not all of the properties that people could own are the same. So he makes divisions within those propertied and propertyless classes. That is, within capitalists and within workers, there are further divisions that Weber thinks are particularly important. And for Weber, what really matters here is what kinds of skills and credentials do you as a worker have, right? So he's going to slice up what the working class is for Marx into those doctors who have really high skills, right? Really difficult to acquire and difficult to use skills. Right? They have particular skills, so when they go to sell their labor power, they're able to command a much higher wage in exchange for that than are the janitors, right? Whose skills, broadly speaking, everyone possesses, and so there's a lot more people who could take that job. But he also does the same thing with capital. How scarce is that capital that you own, and how much of it do you actually possess and own and control? And that's really thinking about the difference between a big gigantic corporation relative so a big corporation owned by a family like Walmart, owned by the Waltons, relative to owning your local hardware store. Those are two very different kinds of property that one could own. And then this guy comes along in the 1950s and says, okay, so his name is Ralph Derendorf, and he says, okay, that makes some sense, but there's a further distinction that we could make here around around authority relationships. Who is in control inside of firms. So think about that big corporation. It's very often the case that it's not the owners who are directing what goes on within the organization, but CEOs and then sets of managers down lower than who are in charge of actually implementing the organization and making it effective. And so that creates a set of authority relationships between those who are managing other people and those who are managed by other people. And so we've got now a set of property relationships organized around who owns what, a set of credentials or skills that is really about what specific kind of things you own on a market that you can sell for higher or lower wages, or what kinds of property you control. And then Derendorf gives us authority relationships. So we can think about property relationships, kind of market skill relationships, and then authority relationships. And if we put all of those together, we get we can see that some people then have more power to gain and control resources within a given a set of these relationships. These are all relationships between different class actors that give some people power and control and dominance over those other actors. The ability to extract larger incomes for themselves, that is more of those resources that are stratified in a society, some more power over other people in those relationships, etc. And so we can land then on a way of putting all of this together, which a sociologist named Eric Olin Wright does for us in thinking about his class map, where we can think about relationships to authority, where we can start with with relationships to the means of production, and there we get this distinction between those who own the means of production and those who are employees. And then those who own the means of production can be further divided in terms of how many employees they own, and whether or not they, or excuse me, not that they own, how many employees they have in their employee, and relative to those who don't have any employees, right? And then you can think and slice up those who are employees by their relationship to authority and their relationship to scarce skills. Right? So we can think about those expert managers like doctors who are in control of their work and are often controlling other people's work as well. And we can think about then about those non-skilled workers who are janitors and all of the different layers in between. So you should really, for example, take those jobs that exist within a hospital and place them inside of this class map, and we can think through exactly who gets located where inside of these class relations. All right, that's all for now. We'll talk to you later.